Welcome to Marxist Criticism Part 2. In this lecture, we're going to examine Marxist social theory after the 1960s. In the 1960s, a variety of new theoretical paradigms emerged, which put into question the prevailing conceptions of critical social theory. While debates emerged between advocates of critical theory and the postmodern approaches, there were also some common positions. The critical theory of the so-called Frankfurt School, discussed in the first video of this series, offered a multidisciplinary approach which combined perspectives from sociology, cultural theory, philosophy, history, and psychoanalysis, among others. Critical theory sought a connection with empirical analysis and social activism, attempting to transform society in progressive ways. In this sense, the contribution of the Frankfurt School was very important because it began to establish an interdisciplinary dialogue, criticizing the validity of the claims of separate disciplines, attempting to create a more global form of social criticism. Upon taking the position of director of the Institute for Social Research at the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, Max Horkheimer and his collaborators, Marcuse and Adorno, focused their efforts not only towards the exploration of the roots of power structures within social processes, but also fighting the division of sciences, which, according to Horkheimer, reproduced the fragmentation, specialization, and division of labor under capitalism. So they tried to create the conditions for social practices to be critical and respond to this fragmentation exerted by dominant ideologies. In discussions within the Institute, Marcuse first argued that Horkheimer's manifesto underplayed the importance of philosophy. Horkheimer agreed with this position in his subsequent research, and he tried to integrate philosophy and cultural theory, even if he continued to emphasize the social sciences as more relevant. Critical theory is thus rooted in critical activity, directed as an oppositional, and hence Adorno's negative dialectics, and involved in a struggle for social change and for the unification of theories and practices coming from very diverse areas. As explored in Part 1, the critical theorists of the Frankfurt School argued that Marx's concepts such as commodity, value, exchange, fetishism characterized not only the capitalist economy but also social relations under capitalism, since all forms of human relations are governed by exchange relations. Building on Georgi Lukács' theory of reification, they argue that capitalist society produces a rigid, reified structure, defined by Lukács in his essay from 1923, Reification and the Consciousness of the Proletariat, and which was part of his book, History and Class Consciousness. This book was not translated until 1971. So reification was defined as the process by which human social relations are perceived as carrying commodity attributes that appear to be natural and thus forming a system of control upon human life. Reification entails a stance that separates subjects from their objective world, creating a disengaged relation in which people can no longer have a critical mindset. Critical theories describe the mediations or interconnections between the different spheres, seeking to expose also the contradictions and conflicts among the various domains of the social system. Theodor Adorno and Walter Benjamin, for instance, tried to incorporate psychoanalytic perspectives as well as the impact of cultural industries and technological change, mass communications, as modes of social control and mass deception. using entertainment to sugarcoat oppression while eroding cultural standards in order to quell any forms of expression which might contest the given order. It is in this sense that Marxist literary criticism began to be viewed as a type of cultural criticism, which analyzes the discourses of power present in all forms of cultural products. As indicated, Western Marxist criticism underwent renewal and diversification in the 1960s and 70s, becoming more visible within academic literary studies and interacting with a growing range of other critical schools and disciplines, from structuralism, psychoanalytic criticism, feminist criticism, post-colonial theory, deconstruction, or new historicism. In this neo-Marxist phase, the traditional Marxist metaphor of economic causality, in which a superstructure of political and cultural forms grew up from a base of economic forces and relations, was either openly challenged, as it happens in the research carried out by British socialist critic Raymond Williams, who inspired the school of cultural materialism, or was either set aside in favor of explorations of literature relations with ideology and with the specific cultural contradictions of modern capitalist society. In the 1970s, structuralism introduced a displacement on the problematic of representational relations. Discourse and texts, considered the basis of any other form of representation, were no longer seen as signifying practices related to any external, real or natural world shared by everyone. They began to be seen as a system of practices of signification that exist as a structure, a tissue or texture of perceptions, responses, and meanings, which are already representations and function in an autonomous semiotic practice not subordinated to any external reality. A consequence of this was that any representation worked by text and discourse could be seen as belonging to the realm of ideology, both individual and social, and thus constrained by cultural power conditions. One of the first authors to explore in this lecture is Lucien Goldman, a Romanian theorist based in France, who rejected the idea that texts are creations of individual genius and argued that they are based upon a trans-individual mental structure belonging to particular social groups constructed in response to the changing reality before them. Such mental images, almost like Jungian archetypes, are half realized in the consciousness of social agents, but the great artists and writers are able to make them visible, an idea that was also introduced by romantic artists such as William Blake. Goldman's Le Dieu caché, the hidden God, established connections between Racine's tragedies, Pascal's philosophy, and a French religious movement called Jansenism, which argued that manifest content of Racine's tragedies appeared to have connection with this Jansenism, but at that deeper structural level, they share the same form. The tragic hero is radically alone in a world where God has abandoned the human race. In another of his volumes, Pour une sociologie du roman, for a sociology of the novel, Goldman resembles the Frankfurt School and considers the similarities between the structure of the modern novel and that of market economy. He argues that by 1910, the transition from the heroic age of liberal capitalism to an imperialist phase was well underway, and a consequence of this was the importance of the individual within the economic life was drastically reduced. So in the post-1945 period, post-war, economic systems became to be increasingly controlled by corporations, which established reification, the term already introduced by George Lucas to refer to the reduction of value and exchange value, imposing the domination of objects. So Goldman explains that in the classic novel, objects only had significance in relation to individuals. But in the novels of the modernist and avant-garde authors such as Sartre, Kafka, or Rob Grillet, the world of objects begins to displace the individual. Marcuse describes Goldman's main contribution in the following terms, and you have the quotation on your screen. Lucien Goldman has stated the central problem of Marxist aesthetics in the period of advanced capitalism. If the proletariat is not the negation of the existing society, but to a great extent integrated into it, then Marxist aesthetics is confronted with a situation where authentic forms of cultural creations exist, though they cannot be attached to the consciousness, even a potential one, of a particular social group. The decisive question, therefore, is how the link is made between the economic structures and literary manifestations in a society where this link occurs outside the collective consciousness, that is, without being grounded in a progressive class consciousness, without expressing such consciousness. In France, structuralist Marxism is represented by the philosopher Louis Althusser. Ideology is disseminated by what Althusser calls the ideological state apparatus, institutions such as the legal system and media that are maintained by what he calls the repressive state apparatus, the police and the army. Thus, Marxism is to him the science of society that enables us to see through the manipulations of the dominant ideology and to develop a revolutionary class consciousness. Althusser rejected Hegel's account of totality, according to which the essence of the whole is expressed in its part, and which had influenced earlier forms of Marxism. Althusser avoids terms such as social system and order because they suggest a structure with a center, which determines the form of all its parts. Instead, he talks of a decentered structure with no governing principle, no fixed origin, and no overall unity. The various elements or levels within the social formation are not treated as reflections of one essential level, the economic level. The levels possess a relative autonomy. The social formation is a structure in which the various levels exist in complex relations of inner contradictions and mutual conflicts, never simple. This structure of contradictions may be dominated at any given stage by one or other of the levels, but which level it is to be itself determined ultimately by the economic level. For example, as Marx himself observed, in feudal society formations, religion is structurally dominant. But this does not mean that religion is the essence or center of the structure. Its leading role is itself determined by the economic level, though not directly. So you have a quotation there from Althusser's Philosophy of the Encounter. There exists a word in German, Geschichte, which designates not only accomplished history, but history in the present, doubtless determined in large part, yet only in part, by the already accomplished past. For a history which is present, which is living, is also open to a future, that is uncertain, unforceable, and not yet accomplished, and therefore aleatory. Living history obeys only a constant, not a law, the constant of class struggle. Marx did not use the term constant, which I have taken from Levi-Strauss, but an expression of genius, tangential law, capable of inflicting but not contradicting the primary tendential law, which means that a tendency that does not possess the form or figure of linear law, but that it can bifurcate under the impact of an encounter with another tendency, and so on ad infinitum. At each intersection, the tendency can take a path that is unforeseeable because it is aleatory. Althusser finds that the concept of reification is also very important and similar to that of alienation, developed in the early the German ideology and in Marx's economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844. All forms of reification may be due to the pathologies of intersubjectivity, based on struggles for recognition, since ideologies create a sense of common identity and offer people a satisfying mirror image so that they can identify with a given group. So even though Althusser shows that ideologies construct the subjects, these are the result of many complex and different social determinants. In a letter on art, Althusser draws upon Engels and Balzac and explains that art makes us see, in a distant way, the ideology from which it is born, in which it bathes and from which it detaches itself as art, and to which it alludes. Althusser defines ideology as a representation of the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. The imaginary consciousness helps to make sense of the world, but also masks or represses the real relationships to it. He adds that the concept of freedom promotes this belief, but it might mask the real relationships in a system dominated by certain classes and structures. According to Althusser, art achieves a retreat, a sort of critical distance, and in this way it can serve to expose dominant ideologies in an inherent form. You have a quotation there from Lenin and other essays. What art makes us see, and therefore gives us to us in form of seeing, perceiving, and feeling, which is not the form of knowing, is the ideology from which it is born, in which it bathes, from it which detaches itself as art, and which it eludes. The implications of Althusser's ideas were refined by his disciple Pierre Macherey. In a theory of literary production from 1966, he states that criticism must get beneath the surface of a text's ideological assumptions by inquiring into what it is not said in the text itself, that is, exposing its silences, evasions, ambiguities, and ironies as unconscious meanings emerging from the apparent surface. Rather than treating the text as a creation or a self-contained artifact, Macherey regards it as a production in which materials are worked over and changed in a process that is largely unconscious. Macherey explains that ideology emerges as an unconscious process irrespective of authorial intentions. These ideas have been also shared by Frederick Jameson in The Political Unconscious, a volume from 1981. Thus, ideology appears as an imaginary discourse within the text, and its contradictions are exposed in interpretation by paying attention to the lapses, omissions, and repressed aspects. For example, Daniel Defoe's novels Robinson Crusoe and Moll Flanders evidence the contradiction of bourgeois ideology in the early 18th century. Crusoe has been interpreted as an early model of colonialism, where individualism seems to be in contradiction with the need for communal experience in his relation with Friday. In the case of Maud Flanders, the protagonist debates herself between moral and economic requirements, the dilemma of having to sell her own body in order to survive in a society ruled by the marketplace. Mackay discloses these silences and contradictions following what Althusser termed as symptomatic reading, which reveals the limits of the hidden ideology of the text. In another paper on literature as an ideological form from 1978, written in collaboration with Etienne Balibar, Mackay departed more radically from the traditional notion of literature which the Frankfurt School had defended. These authors rethink the literary as a fundamental aspect of the education system, serving to reproduce class domination in language located in what Althusser had termed the ideological state apparatus. The revival of Marxist criticism in Britain, in decline since the 1930s, was fueled by the 1968 Troubles and by the ensuing influx of continental ideas. The New Left Review was an important channel, for example. A major theorist emerged in response to specific conditions, and this is Raymond Williams, who was associated with the New Left political movement in Great Britain, and the development of cultural materialism and the cultural studies movement, which originated at Birmingham University in the Center for Contemporary Culture Studies. Williams embarked on a radical theoretical construction of the whole domain of social meaning, culture, as a whole way of life, performing a critical reassessment of the main English tradition of critical cultural thought and exploring drama, the novel, and television in his volume Culture and Society, 1780 to 1950, published in 1958. In the English novel From Dickens to Lawrence, which was published in 1970, Williams relates the Victorian novels to historical and cultural developments in England, which by the end of the 1840s was the world's first urban society. The crucial achievement of this period, according to Williams, was the generation of novelists which began to explore community. Williams' critical method shows this network of social relations in the face of industrialization, and he's interested in the way books present the culture in which they are written and express and define their contemporary society. He refers, for example, to Dickens, whom he praises for the creation of a consciousness of community and for his ability to dramatize those social institutions and consequences which are not accessible to ordinary physical observation. On your screen, a quotation from Williams' volume The Country and the City. From the late 18th century onwards, it is no longer from the practice of community, but from being a wanderer that the instinct of fellow feeling is derived. Thus, an essential isolation and silence and loneliness become the carriers of nature and community against the rigors, the cold abstinence, and the selfish ease of ordinary society. After 1977, with the publication of Marxism and Literature, Williams began to define his position alongside the lines proposed by Italian philosopher and political activist Antonio Gramsci, further exploring the concept of hegemony and patterns of domination, subordination, and opposition. According to Williams, the formal operations of dominant ideology went beyond social control, manipulation, and indoctrination to a saturation that, according to him, is embedded in all human cultural processes. And you have the quotation there from Marxism and Literature. Hegemony creates a culture which encompasses the dominance of a particular class, covering all practices. It thus constitutes a sense of reality for most people in the society, a sense of absolute. But a culture which has also to be seen as the lived dominance and subordination of particular classes. So this way of thinking places Williams decisively in a Marxist tradition, as well as the founder of a politicized historicist mode of critical theory termed cultural materialism. Cultural materialism developed even more in the following years to provide a means of ideological analysis of the rapidly expanding cultural industry that included new forms of entertainment, advertising, publishing, and so on. It also began to explore the transition from a traditional form of popular culture to mass culture in late capitalist societies, emphasizing the significance of the patterns of consumption of cultural artifacts. At the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies in Birmingham University, Jamaican-born British Marxist sociology Stuart Hall continued Williams' path and explored the contradictory interrelationships between canonical and non-canonical cultural forms as they are used in the formation of national popular cultures, linking Marxism and post-colonial theory. Hall left the center in 1979 to become professor of sociology at the Open University. He was president of the British Sociological Association between 1995 and 97. And in the following video, you can see a detailed discussion of Hall's ideas as regarding the post-colonial theory. Some of his ideas are sketched below as follows. There is no understanding of Englishness without understanding its imperial and colonial dimensions. I have never worked on race and ethnicity as a kind of subcategory. I've always worked on the whole social formation, which is racialized, he explained. And finally, popular culture is one of the sides where this struggle for and against the culture of the powerful is engaged. It is the stake to which to be won and lost in that struggle. It is the arena of consent and resistance. It is partly where hegemony arises, but it is one of the places where socialism might be constituted. This is why popular culture matters. So as I have mentioned, there will be another lecture on post-colonial theory, and some of Stuart Hall's ideas will be explored in more detail. Terry Eagleton is another fundamental figure in the Marxist scene in Great Britain. He's currently Distinguished Professor of English Literature at Lancaster University, and he was formerly employed at University of Oxford and University of Manchester. Eagleton has family ties with Ireland through his mother's side, and he was educated at La Salle College, a Roman Catholic grammar school in Salford, a city in the northwest England where he was born, and later at University of Cambridge. In the 1980s, he published a paper in the New Left Review, distancing himself from his former mentor, Raymond Williams. One of his first volumes, among a very prolific production, was Criticism and Ideology from 1976, and it focused on literary discourse as a productive practice, placing emphasis on its institutional determinations. Eagleton argued that the problematic depended upon the assumption of an ontological split between the real and its reproduction, which was not present in previous Hegelian dialectical approach. Like Althusser, Eagleton argues that the central problem is to define the relationship between literature and ideology, because in his view, texts do not reflect historical reality, but rather work upon ideology to produce an effect of the real. And you have a quotation there from Criticism and Ideology. Ideology is present to such an extent in all the agent's activities that it becomes indistinguishable from the lived experience. Ideology is therefore necessarily false. Its social function is not to give agents a true knowledge of the social structure, but simply to insert them, as it were, into their practical activities. At the level of experience, the social whole remains opaque to the agents, as opposed to science ideology, has the precise function of hiding the real contradictions and of reconstituting on an imaginary level a relatively coherent discourse which serves as the horizons of agents' experience. Thus, the text may appear to be free in its relation to reality. It can invent characters and situations at will, but it is not free of ideology. Ideology is part of any system of representation, aesthetic, religious, judicial, and so on. However, unlike Althusser, Eagleton, who believed that literature could distance itself from ideology, for Eagleton, the literary text exerts a complex reworking of already existing ideological discourses, special production of ideology. And you have a quotation there from What is Literature? Literature transforms and intensifies ordinary language, deviates systematically from everyday speech. If you approach me at a bus stop and murmur, "Thou still and ravished bride of quietness," then I am instantly aware that I am in the presence of the literary. So Eagleton's criticism is concerned with the laws of the reproduction of ideological discourses as literature. In order to explore this, he surveys a sequence of novels from George Eliot to D.H. Lawrence, arguing that 19th century bourgeois ideology blended Victorian utilitarianism with organicist concepts of society arising from the Romantic humanist tradition. The purpose of this blending was to incorporate a view of solidarity and sympathy within growing capitalist trends. According to Eagleton, the writers he examined attempted to come to terms with these contradictions. Eagleton uses the example of D.H. Lawrence in his novel Lady Chatterley's Lover, where he reads the character of Mellors as a combination of male assertiveness and female tenderness, a combination he indicates occurs in several of Lawrence's novels. And you have a quotation there from Criticism and Ideology referring to Lawrence, Lady Chatterley. In Lady Chatterley's Lover, the image of the father is finally rehabilitated in the figure of Mellors. Yet, Mellors combines impersonal male power with female tenderness, working class, achieving a mythical resolution of the contradictions which beset Lawrence's work. In the late 1970s, Eagleton became more influenced by post-structuralist and deconstructive tenets, including Walter Benjamin, Paul de Man, and Jacques Derrida. He criticized the lack of material and class interest in these trends, but thought that as methodologies they could undermine fixed and absolute forms of knowledge linked to power structures, even if they did not propose a close connection with the practical activity as truly revolutionary movements. Eagleton's major book in this phase was Walter Benjamin or Towards the Revolutionary Criticism from 1981. Eagleton reads Benjamin's view of history as a violent grasping of past historical meaning threatened and obscured by reactionary and repressive memories. And you have a quotation there, not from the Walter Benjamin or Towards Revolutionary Criticism, the volume itself, but from an article that Eagleton published in the New Statesman in 2009, referring to Walter Benjamin. The German philosopher Walter Benjamin had the curious notion that we could change the past. For most of us, the past is fixed, while the future is open. Benjamin thought that the past could be transformed by what we do in the present. Not literally transform, of course, since the one sure thing about the past is that it does not exist. What Benjamin meant was that how we act in the present can change the meaning of the past. The past may not literally exist any more than the future does, but it leaves on its consequences, which are a vital part of it. Benjamin also thought this about works of art. In his view, the meaning of a work of art is something that evolves over time. Great poems and novels are like slow-burning fuses. As they enter into new, unpredictable situations, they begin to release new meanings that the author himself could not have foreseen. So Eagleton also explores some of the authors that Benjamin was also interested on, such as Bertolt Brecht plays, particularly the Threepenny Opera, and also Brecht's adaptation of Shakespeare's Coriolanus. In The Rape of Clarissa, Writing Sexuality and Class Struggle from 1982, Eagleton performs a rereading of Richardson's novel and uses Freudian and Lacanian psychoanalysis as well as a Marxist approach to produce a complex critical reading that includes gender concerns. In another volume from 1983, Literary Theory and Introduction, which remains his most popular book, he traces an evolution of literary theory. And in The Ideology of Aesthetics from 1990, he reviews the heritage of the Frankfurt School in post-Enlightenment Europe. Another volume from 1995, Heathcliff and the Great Hunger, examines Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights and the impact of the Irish famine in the novel. He also considers the situation of the Irish exiles, noticeable Oscar Wilde and George Bernard Shaw. Because of his ties with Ireland, several of Eagleton's books, particularly in the late 1990s, focus on Ireland. For example, in Crazy Young and the Bishop and Other Essays on Irish Culture, or in Scholars and Rebels, Irish Cultural Thought from Burke to Yeats, Eagleton brings to light communities of intellectuals centered upon Dublin University Magazine and related to the Young Ireland movement, for example, William Wilde, Charles Lever, or Sheridan Le Fanu. And he explores them as sustained forms of cultural materialism and Irish anti-colonial dissent. Writing a review for The Guardian in 2006, Eagleton notes, Irish fiction is full of secrets, guilty past, divided identities. It is no wonder that there is such a rich tradition of Gothic writing in a nation so haunted by history. Gothic fascination with ruins and ancient crimes, spine priests and blood-stained stories are tailor-made for the place. The past in Ireland refuses a decent burial. Instead, it preys on the living in the monstrous form of the undead. The author of the greatest book of the undead, Dracula, was a Dublin civil servant. For all their hard-headedness, the Protestant ascendancy which governed Ireland for 2 centuries were a remarkably spooky bunch, as W.B. Yeats' Dublin in ghouls and demons bear witness. James Joyce's hero, Stephen Dedalus, declares that he's trying to awake from the nightmare of history, but the worst nightmare of all is to think that you have woken up only to find that you haven't.
My forthcoming book, The Event of Literature, is a sort of time warp in a way, because it is actually a sort of return to pure literary theory, which these days is less popular than it was in the 80s and 90s. Literary theory as such, I think, was finally overtaken by other developments, particularly post-colonialism, postmodernism, and so on. And in the process, a number of important questions of literary theory that I think hadn't really got answered, including the old chestnut, what is literature, was in a sense put on the back burner. And so my new book, The Event of Literature, is actually a very consciously return to the days of what you might call high or pure literary theory, raising questions about narrative, about literature, about fictionality, about literary language, which in a sense, as I say, have been shelved really for too long over that intervening period. Literature as a concept, as we know it today, is of very recent historical provenance. It basically probably comes to us only from the end of the 18th century, from the Romantic period. And it comes to us with a huge, it's fraught with a huge important history. That's to say, it comes out of a situation of great social turbulence, the Industrial Revolution and so on, the political revolutions in France and America, where history was moving rapidly under people's feet, and they felt that certain things of value were being threatened, and art or literature became repositories of value that had then to be rather jealously protected from the winds of history. So the concept of literature as a sort of privileged enclave that we receive is by no means common to human history. It comes out of a very recent past. How far do questions of literary theory matter is an important point. It's hard to weigh that up, I think. How far does literature matter? It matters enormously, of course, for people who are engaged in it. But, of course, the vast majority of people aren't. That's one reason, I think, why there was a shift sometime in the 1980s, perhaps, from literature to culture. There was a kind of seismic shift there, because if you define culture in a broad and generous sense, then of course it's something that most people are bound up with. Indeed, I tend to say these days that if you want a definition of culture, it's what people are prepared to kill for. I don't mean for Bach and Beethoven, but I mean for identity, language, and so on. How far these things matter is difficult. Literary theory was important because it opened literature up into areas, political, psychoanalytical, which do matter clearly to anybody, I think. It was partly an attempt to give a new kind of relevance to the study of literature, and make it more exciting. But I still, I would say that although culture is what people are prepared to kill for or die for, as a good old materialist, I still don't think that culture is where it's at. I mean, I don't think that culture, however important it is, goes all the way down. And therefore, culture is a bit like sexuality. It's always very hard to avoid either overestimating it or underestimating it. The Event of Literature is, I think, a book for people who remain interested in literary theory, or indeed for people who want to come to it afresh and who haven't had much training or history in it. But I hope it's also a book not just for people in literature. I mean, it begins, for example, with looking at the medieval debates between the realists and the nominalists, which are not at all about literature, but so that in the process of raising the question, what is literature, what is fiction, I hope I'm raising issues which are of more general import and which, are relevant to people who aren't actually in the area of literature at all. Well, the historical moment is clearly right for my recent book, Why Marx Was Right. I mean, it's a clear intersection of a book and a historical moment, though I didn't actually sit down to write this book because of the crisis of capitalism. Once again, I rarely have that clear-cut an idea of why I'm writing. But clearly, looking back, that must have fed into the book a great deal. 10 years ago, on the brink of the new millennium, Marxism was finished, grand narratives were finished, history was effectively over, even in a certain sense philosophy was over. We were post-ideological, post-metaphysical, post-religious, and what we had just 10 years ago really was a sort of history frozen and arrested in a kind of rather piecemeal pragmatism that believed that capitalism was the only game in town now and would be for this foreseeable future. A year later, with the World Trade Center tragedy, everything changed. New grand narratives got started up, and then an almighty crisis of the capitalist system. And what happens, I think, when the capitalism hits a crisis is that it makes it newly perceptible as a system. Normally it's just the invisible air we breathe. We can't even objectify it. Capitalism, a crisis in capitalism, does what Marx himself did, ironically, which was to show this way of life up as a determinate system with a certain history, very recent, working by certain laws, and so on. And that's the cue I take, as it were, for this recent book. There are many ways you can write a book on the relevance of Marxism today, or socialism. I thought the most interesting rhetorically was to put myself in the shoes of as it were, the average person who feels that Marxism is irrelevant or offensive or authoritarian or backward-looking, and just to try to respond to each of these criticisms. So the book takes a familiar criticism of Marxism, that it's tyrannical, or it's deterministic, or it reduces everything to economics, or it's hopelessly utopian, and tries specifically to respond to these complaints. The reader pretty well is the imagined reader, the implied reader, is somebody. Not just an average person with an average response to Marxism, but actually somebody with a fairly hostile response to it, as so many people have. The book tries to show that that most of those criticisms are largely unfounded. Indeed, that of all modern thinkers, Marx is perhaps the most astonishingly travestied and caricatured, that the common image that people have of his work is in many ways light years away from what he actually wrote. So the work is, in a sense, the book is a kind of work of demystification, among other things.
We turn now to the political landscape of the United States, where the labor movement has been included from political power, and the appearance of major Marxist theorists is an important achievement. The principal exponents are Frederick Jameson and Frank Lentrichia. After a sequence of studies on the Frankfurt School members and associates, Adorno, Benjamin, Marcuse, Bloch, as well as Lukács, in Jameson's Marxism and Form from 1971 presents the outline of a dialectical criticism that, according to him, needs the Hegelian imprint to survive in the contemporary climate of post-industrial production, where the relationship of parts to the global whole, as well as the opposition between concrete and abstract, and the concept of totality and the interaction between subjects and objects continue to be, according to him, major concerns. So Marxism and Form is an attempt to further establish the Hegelian relation between spirit and matter, individual experience and the wide forms of institutional society, as well as the language of existence and that of history, according to Jameson's own words. Jameson explores the use of analogy in this process, and he explains that analogic processes enable the transfer between the socioeconomic macrocosms or infrastructure to the superstructure. Dialectical criticism interprets literary works always as part of a larger structure, and that of the historical situation. In this regard, Jameson shows that Wayne Booth's rhetoric of fiction from 1961, which expanded the concept of point of view in a novel, is related to an implied relativism and rejection of any fixed or absolute viewpoint or a standard of judgment characteristic of modern capitalist societies. Jameson explains that by defending the specific point of view represented by the implied author, Booth tries to restore the certainties of the 19th century novel, a move which reflects a nostalgia for a time of greater middle-class stability in an orderly class system. Jameson explains that a Marxist dialectical criticism will always recognize the historical origins of its own concepts and will never allow the concepts to become assimilated into a sort of lack of awareness. Dialectical criticism will always unmask the inner form of tests, which can also be dependent of the genre. Taking Hemingway as an example, he contends that the dominant category of experience in the novel is the process of writing itself, a process that in the case of Hemingway reflects the masculine ideals of American society in the way he presents the characters and situations in which they are involved, being ingrained in a very concrete historical moment. And you have a quotation there from Marxism and Form. It is a mistake to think that Marxism is simply a type of interpretation that takes the economic sequence as that ultimate privilege code into which the other sequences are to be translated. Rather, for Marxism, the emergence of the economic, the coming into view of the infrastructure itself, is simply the sign of the approach of the concrete. Jameson's next volume, The Prison's House of Language from 1972, is an exploration of Russian formalism and structuralism from the point of view of a Marxist historical materialism that concludes in Jameson's best-known volume, The Political Unconscious from 1981, where he integrates these theoretical traditions as well as post-structuralism and psychoanalysis into a Marxist synthesis. He uses Argildas-Greimas structuralist theory, the semiotic rectangle, as an analytic tool that allows the exploration of a wide range of possible human relations presented in concrete formal patterns in the texts. Jameson also notes that there are unsaid aspects in the text that represent repressed forms of history. Furthermore, Jameson explains that narrative is not just a literary form for an essential epistemological category, because reality presents itself not to the human mind only in the form of stories. Even a scientific theory is a story, and because all narratives require interpretation, Jameson argues that any form of interpretation that tries to fully explain the texts impoverishes its complexity and multiplies and carries ideological aspects that might not be fully conscious. Thus, taking and extending Freud's concept of repression from the individual to the collective level, Jameson argues that any form of ideology represses revolutionary and divergent patterns of thinking, making them conform to the convergence of the majority. In this way, Jameson shares with Althusser a view of social totality as a decenter structure, in which various levels develop in a relative autonomy and work on different time scales. For example, the coexistence of feudal and capitalist time scales. The complexity of this heterogeneous vision of history is mirrored in the materiality and heterogeneity of texts, according to Jameson. Although Jameson's project may sound very close to post-structuralist tenets, the main difference is that post-structuralism and deconstruction abolish the distinction between representation that is the text, and reality, by treating reality itself as a test, arguing that humans have no way of knowing if their perceptions and forms of cognition are external to their language, since, as Wittgenstein had already argued, our language and thought are inseparable. Jameson goes on to show that different forms of critical interpretation reflect the development of society, the evolution of forms of thinking, all serving changing economic needs. Jameson's strong epistemological understanding of narrative illuminates the motivation of what remains his most important work to date, Postmodernism, or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, from 1991. Where he maintains that postmodernism is not merely a style, but rather the cultural dominant of our time, a totalizing system which, in league with the operations of the global market under late capitalism, saturates all aspects of social, cultural, and economic life, and so conditions at the deepest levels what we know of the contemporary world. Jameson looks in particular to a strategy he terms cognitive mapping, and which he sees as a political act directed to a global world of unmappable multinational capital. He argues that the skeptical mode of characteristic of postmodern thinking presents no progress of movement forward and operates only as a sort of self-reflection and impasse on the impossibility of historical change. In his latest writings, Jameson has continued to question the concept of modernity and its fundamental meaning, where the standardization of capitalist globalization casts great doubts on any hope of cultural diversity in a world colonized by a sort of universal market order.
First of all, I distinguish between postmodernism as a style that essentially emerged in architecture and then that became visible in all the other arts and literature and everything else, and then that seemed to be replaced by other styles, so that now people say, oh, postmodernism is past, now we have contemporaneity or some new word for all these styles. Okay, yes, I don't mind saying that stylistically these things change. But what I've tried to describe, and I didn't make it clear in my first studies, maybe I wasn't clear about it myself, is that I'm not trying to describe postmodernism, although I use that as a diagnosis, but I'm trying to describe postmodernity. And postmodernity is not a style, it's a structure. I would say it's a moment of capitalism, of the third moment of capitalism, a globalized capitalism, which is what I'm calling postmodernity. And it brings with it many kinds of changes. It doesn't go away like a style. We will be in postmodernity for a long time. It is a third structure of the market, and so on and so forth. Now, sure, one visible sign of the emergence of postmodernity was the triumph of the free market people, from Reagan, Mrs. Thatcher, the economists, and so on and so forth. I think now, since the crisis, people may be a little bit less exuberant about this economic strategy. But that doesn't mean that we're outside of, that we have left postmodernity, which has to do with global connections, finance capital, communications networks, computers, all the computer technology, and so on and so forth. So on the contrary, I feel that it's very useful to talk about this as a whole new moment and to explore it in that way. Now, if you don't want to call it postmodernity, we could call it something else. Late capitalism, third stage of capitalism, I don't know. But we are still certainly very much in this thing which began to emerge in the 80s, I suppose, of which we began to become conscious in the 80s. In my book, one of my mistakes, it wasn't a mistake then, but it became a mistake, was to have used the word postmodernism rather than postmodernity, as I just said. And I should have distinguished more clearly, but it wasn't clear at the time. I should have distinguished more clearly between postmodernism as an artistic and cultural style and postmodernity as a structure. And one reason I didn't do that was because when I wrote these things, that's the early 1980s, we did not yet have another word, and that word is globalization.
As mentioned, alongside Frederick Jameson, another exponent of the United States Marxist approach is Frank Lentricia. He is a novelist, critic, and professor of film studies at Duke University, and he also became influential through his account of trends in critical theory in his volume After the New Criticism. But returning to Europe, possibly the most important figure after the 1960s was French philosopher, historian of ideas, social theorist, and literary critic Michel Foucault. Foucault studied under Louis Althusser at the University of Paris in Sorbonne, and in 1961 he published his first book, Histoire de la Folie, translated into English as Madness and Civilization in 1964, and more recently has been translated as The History of Madness. In this volume, he introduces his own experiences and readings on psychology while working in a mental hospital between 1955 and 1959. As part of his educational posts in the French Cultural Center in several cities, in several countries, Sweden, Germany, and Poland. Foucault focuses on how society deals with fringe elements, for example, madness, and on impersonal powers that silently oppress society. He orders history only through the interplay of forms of power. Foucault examines the evolving meaning of madness in European culture, law, politics, philosophy, and medicine from the Middle Ages to the end of the 18th century. He uses the language of phenomenology to describe the evolving experience of the mad person as the other, attributing this evolution to the influence of social power structures. And you have a quotation there from Madness and Civilization. At the opposite pole to this nature of shadows, madness fascinates because it is knowledge. It is knowledge first because all these absurd figures are in reality elements of a difficult, hermetic, esoteric learning. These strange forms are situated from the first in the space of the great secret, that step by which he keeps from crossing the forbidden limits of knowledge. From a structuralist perspective, Foucault explores madness in relation to the evolution of the concept of reason and unreason, and indicates that the Renaissance marked the beginning of objective descriptions. During the 17th century, Foucault explores how mad people were confined and separated from society, an idea he would expand later in relation to his concept of heterotopias. Foucault analyzes the programs of punishment and reward designed to assimilate mad and immoral outcasts into the system. Frequently, these outcasts were just people who rebel against the state apparatus. He goes on to explore workhouses and orphanages during the 18th and 19th centuries, places that were presented as providing forms of social welfare, but that they were instead a source of cheap labor. The French critic explains how these institutions functioned outside the judicial system with their own regulations, constructing the figure of the madman as a mental illness. And we have another quotation. The constitution of madness as a mental illness at the end of the 18th century affords the evidence of broken dialogue, posits the separation has already affected and thrust into oblivion all those stammered, imperfect words without fixed syntax in which the exchange between madness and reason was made. In order to understand Foucault's hermetic and esoteric metaphors, it might be useful for the listener to refer to my lectures on myth criticism and examine the archetype of the madman, a sort of middleman or mediator that crosses between worlds. You have another quotation there where, from the same volume, Madness and Civilization, where Foucault explains the metaphor of navigation and the question of passage crossing between worlds. Navigation brought man's face-to-face with the uncertainty of destiny, where each is left to himself and every departure might always be the last. The madman, on his crazy boat, set sail for the other world, and it is from the other world that he comes when he disembarks. This enforced navigation is both rigorous division and absolute passage, serving to underline, in real and imaginary terms, the liminal situation of the mad in medieval society. Water and navigation had that role to play. He, the madman, is the passenger par excellence, the prisoner of the passage. It is not known where he will land, and when he lands, he knows not whence he came. His truth and his home are the barren wasteland between two lands that can never be his own. One thing is certain, the link between water and madness is deeply rooted in the dream of the Western man. Although Foucault's volume received much criticism coming from the discipline of psychology and psychiatry, it remains an important contribution from the perspective of cultural studies, inspiring the work of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, Anti-Oedipus from 1972, as well as Giorgio Agamben's, who will be explored later in this lecture. Shoshana Feldman and Lillian Feather are two interesting critics who have explored the relationship between writing and madness. In connection with the metaphor of navigation, which Foucault uses in this paragraph, it might be interesting for you to check the connotations in relation to hypertext theory. In this regard, Deep Surface, a game created by Stuart Modrup in 2004, plays with the metaphor of diving and immersion to question the different modes of reading in digital formats, and it's included in the collection of Electronic Literature, Volume 2. Between 1960 and 1966, Foucault worked at the University of Clermont-Ferrand and produced The Birth of the Clinic, where he developed the themes explored in Madness and Civilization, and later in The Order of Things. Foucault coined the term medical gaze to denote the dehumanizing medical separation of the patient's body from the patient's person, identity. He argues that biological reductionism, encouraged by empiricism, based the power of the medical profession on the exploration of the body and other material aspects, gradually structuring any form of power as the absolute value of the visible. This left out any possibility of discourse or dialogue between doctors and patients, imposing also the domain or rationality in diagnosis and treatment. An interesting example of this occurs in Herculine Barbin discovered memoirs of the 19th century French hermaphrodite, a memoir discovered by Foucault during his research about hermaphroditism for the history of sexuality. Herculine, it's the story of a French transsexual individual, and her memoir is framed within the medical gaze of the doctor performing the autopsy and that of the lawyer, and constitute a heartbreaking testimony of her transsexual dilemmas. This memoir inspired Jeffrey Eugenides to write Middlesex, which was published in 2002, and also drew the attention of Judith Butler in her Gender Trouble, which is explored in the lectures on gender in this series of lectures on critical theory. Foucault expanded the idea of the gaze in his notion of episteme, which he presented in Le mot et les choses, an archéologie des sciences humaines. And this was published in 1966 in French and translated into English as The Order of Things in 1970. And here Foucault advances a new notion of episteme, different to the one Aristotle had presented. He explains that as the conditions of discourse, which are common to various areas of knowledge, and determine what is possible and acceptable, and changes over time. He focuses mainly on three areas: linguistics, which determines representation and historical memory; biology, related to the physical aspects of human life; and economics, which, following Marxist perspective, determines social practices. Foucault references three epistemes: the episteme of the Renaissance, which is characterized by resemblance, similitude, and analogy; the classical episteme, characterized by representation, ordering, identity, and difference, giving rise to the categorization and taxonomy; and the modern episteme, which develops from Hegelian organical historical era. So you can see the following quotation. Enumeration will permit us always to deliver a true and certain judgment. The activity of the mind will no longer consist in drawing things together, in setting out on a quest for everything that might reveal some sort of kinship, attraction, or secretly shared nature within them, but on the contrary, in discriminating, that is, in establishing their identities, then the inevitability of the connections with all the successive degrees of a series. In this sense, discrimination imposes upon comparison the primary and fundamental investigation of difference. Any institution, for example the medical clinic in Foucault's previous book, is seen as an artifact inserted within a specific episteme that contemplates reality in a different way, depending on the contemporary language, economic conditions of the period, material aspect, and so on. Swiss structuralist psychologist Jean Piaget compared Foucault's episteme to Thomas Kuhn's notion of paradigm shift. More recently, Timothy Rice has related Foucault's ideas to changing technological conditions that have enabled new ways of seeing the world. In his book from 1997, Knowledge, Discovery and Imagination in Modern Europe, for example, he relates the emergence of these new ways of vision to the discovery of the telescope or the microscope. Foucault opened his book illuminating the shift from the classical era to the 17th century with the complex example of Velázquez's Las Meninas. The painter and the viewer are involved in a complex performances of gazes and relationships which go beyond the literal meaning of the painting. And you have a quotation there from The Order of Things. The order on the basis of which we think today does not have the same mode of being as that of the classical thinkers, despite the impression we may have of an almost uninterrupted development. This continuity of the level of ideas and themes is doubtless only on a surface appearance. The painter is looking, his face turned slightly on his head leaning towards one shoulder. He's staring at a point to which, even though it is invisible, we, the spectators, can easily assign an object, since it is we ourselves who are at that point. Our bodies, our faces, our eyes. The spectacle he's observing is thus doubly invisible. First, because it is not represented within the space of the painting, and second, because it is situated precisely in the blind point, in that essential hiding place into which our gaze disappears from ourselves at the moment of our actual looking. From the eyes of the painter to what he is observing, there runs a compelling line that we, the onlookers, have no power of evading. It runs through the real picture and emerges from its surface to join the place from which we see the painter observing us. A mere confrontation, eyes catching one another's glance, direct looks superimposing themselves upon one another as they cross. And yet, this slender line of reciprocal visibility embraces a whole complex network of uncertainties, exchanges, and feints. Subject and object, spectator and model reverse their roles. Forever unstable the play of metamorphosis, establishing the center between spectator and model. Because we can see only that reverse side. We do not know who we are or what we are doing. Seen or seen? As in other books, Foucault continues to address the relationship between power and knowledge and how they are used as a form of social control through societal institutions in the Archaeology of Knowledge, which he publishes in 1969. Foucault views language as one of the foundations of power. In turn, discourse is regulated by rules of exclusion and internal systems of control grounded on the economic power structures. The method is close to social constructivism, as the researcher tries to understand how our society is being shaped or constructed by language, which in turn reflects existing power relationships. The analysis attempts to understand how individuals view the world and studies categorization, personal and institutional relationships, ideology, and politics. And you have a quotation from the Archaeology of Knowledge. Discourse is not the majestically unfolding manifestations of a thinking, knowing, speaking subject, but, on the contrary, a totality in which the dispersion of the subject and his discontinuity with himself may be determined. In 1970, Foucault was admitted to the Collège de France and became active in a number of left-wing groups involved in campaigns against human rights abuses. In 1975, he published Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison, in parallel to his activities seeking penal reform. And in 1976, he published The History of Sexuality. In Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison, Foucault divided the volume in 4 parts: torture, punishment, discipline, and prison. And he explains that power structures discipline population by sanctioning the knowledge claims of various micro-ideologies, for example, through education or through the use of medical control or the madhouse and also the prison. Foucault's argument is that discipline creates docile bodies. And we have a quotation there from his volume. We must first rid ourselves of the illusion that penality is above all, if not exclusively, a means of reducing crime, and that in this role, according to the social forms, the political systems or belief it may serve or lenient, tend towards expiation of obtaining redress, towards the pursuit of individuals or the attribution of collective responsibility. We must analyze rather the concrete systems of punishment, study them as social phenomena that cannot be accounted for by the judicial structure of society alone, not by its fundamental ethical choices. We must situate them in their field of operation, in which the punishment of crime is not the sole element. We must show the punitive measures are not simply negative mechanisms that make it possible to repress, to prevent, to exclude, to eliminate, but that they are linked to a whole series of positive and useful effects which it is their task to support. So Foucault deals also with the notion of identity and its use as a method of control, regulation, and surveillance. He examines shifts in the mechanisms of power control, exploring public torture as a ritual for demonstrating law enforcement, as well as its unintended consequences of sympathy for the victim. And then he focuses on the switch to prisons and their own public rituals to emphasize the repayment of criminals to society for their infractions. And you have another quotation. A punishment like forced labor or imprisonment, mere loss of liberty, has never functioned without a certain additional element of punishment that certainly concerns the body itself. Rationing of food, sexual deprivation, corporal punishments, solitary confinement. There remains, therefore, a trace of torture in the modern mechanisms of criminal justice, a trace that has not been entirely overcome, but which is enveloped increasingly by the non-corporeal nature of the penal system. An example of this can be seen in the episode of the TV serial Black Mirror, for example, from 2011, entitled White Bear, in which Victoria wakes up and cannot remember anything from her life. Everyone she encounters refuses to communicate with her, and they all film her with their cell phones. Terrified, she's chased by a group of so-called hunters, and with minimum spoilers, it turns out that she is in a justice park for having committed a crime. She's being punished through this exposure to the audience. Foucault explores the development of enforced discipline in the 18th and 19th centuries with the purpose of constructing non-egalitarian power relations through the judicial framework. He writes that historically, and this is the quotation on your screen, historically, the process by which the bourgeoisie became, in the course of the 18th century, the politically dominant class, was marked by the establishment of an explicit code and formally egalitarian juridical framework made possible by the organization of a parliamentary representative regime. But the development and generalization of disciplinary mechanisms constituted the other dark side of these processes. The general judicial form that guaranteed a system of rights that were egalitarian in principle was supported by these tiny everyday physical mechanisms, by all those systems of micropower that are essentially non-egalitarian and asymmetrical that we call disciplines. He explains that, and you have the quotation on your screen, discipline makes individuals. It is the specific techniques of a power that regards individuals both as objects and as instruments of its exercise. It is not a triumphant power. It is a modest, suspicious power, which functions as a calculated but permanent economy. So you have several examples there on your screen from various movies, more or less contemporary, and with Foucault's publication and research. He adds, and you have the quotation again on your screen, Traditionally, power was what was seen, what was shown, and what was manifested. Disciplinary power, on the other hand, is exercised through its invisibility. At the same time, it imposes on those whom it subjects as a principle of compulsory visibility. In discipline, it is the subjects who have to be seen. Their visibility assures the whole of the power that is exercised over them. It is this fact of being constantly seen, of being able always to be seen, that maintains the disciplined individual in his subjection. And the examination of this is the technique by which power, instead of emitting the signs of its potency, instead of imposing its mark on its subjects, holds them in a mechanism of objectification. In this case of domination, disciplinary power manifests its potency essentially by arranging objects. The examination is, as it were, the ceremony of this objectification. Foucault's discussions of techniques includes the Panopticon, a theoretical prison system developed by English philosopher Jeremy Bentham. Bentham stated that the perfect prison surveillance system would be a cylindrical shaped room that held prison cells on the outside walls. In the middle of this spherical room would be a large guard tower with a light that would shine in all the cells. The prisoners thus would never know for certain whether they were being watched, so they would effectively police themselves and be as actors on a stage, given the appearance of submission, even when they are probably not being watched. In this way, power becomes a system of surveillance which is interiorized. Surveillance is thus both regulation and discipline, according to Foucault. Psychological manipulation is one of the first outcomes. Social engineering for the use of tracking people is another way. And you have a quotation there from Discipline and Punish. The perfect disciplinary apparatus would make it possible for a single haze to see everything constantly. A central point will be both the source of light illuminating everything and a locus of convergence for everything that must be known. A perfect eye that nothing would escape at a center towards which all gazes would be turned.
On a l'habitude, du moins dans notre société européenne, de considérer que le pouvoir, il est localisé entre les mains du gouvernement et il s'exerce par un certain nombre d'institutions bien particulières qui sont l'administration, en France on appelle ça préfectorale, enfin je ne sais pas comment on dit ailleurs, l'administration, la police, l'armée. On sait que toutes ces institutions-là sont faites pour transmettre les ordres, les faire appliquer et punir les gens qui n'obéissent pas. Mais je crois que le pouvoir politique, il s'exerce encore, il s'exerce en outre, de plus, par l'intermédiaire d'un certain nombre d'institutions qui ont l'air comme ça de n'avoir rien de commun avec le pouvoir politique, qui ont l'air d'en être indépendantes et qui ne le sont pas. On sait bien que l'université, d'une façon générale, tout le système scolaire, qui en apparence est fait simplement pour distribuer le savoir, on sait que cet appareil scolaire est fait pour maintenir au pouvoir une certaine classe sociale et exclure des instruments du pouvoir toute une autre classe sociale. Quelque chose comme la psychiatrie, qui en apparence aussi n'est destinée qu'au bien de l'humanité et à la connaissance des psychiatres, la psychiatrie est encore une certaine manière de faire peser un pouvoir politique sur un groupe social. La justice également. Bon, et il me semble que la tâche politique actuelle dans une société comme la nôtre, c'est de critiquer le jeu des institutions apparemment les plus neutres et les plus indépendantes, de les critiquer, de l'attaquer de telle manière que la violence politique qui s'exerçait obscurément en eux surgisse et pour qu'on puisse lutter contre elle. À vouloir tout de suite, enfin si on cherche tout de suite à donner le profil et la formule de la société future sans avoir bien fait la critique de tous les rapports de violence politique qui s'exercent dans notre société, on risque de les laisser se reconstituer, même à travers des formes aussi nobles, apparemment aussi pures que celles du syndicalisme anarchiste.
Yes, I would certainly agree with that, not only in theory but also in action. That is, there are two intellectual tasks. One, and the one which I was discussing, to try to create the vision of a future just society. Another task is to understand very clearly the nature of power and oppression and terror and destruction in our own society. And that certainly includes the institutions you mentioned, as well as the central institutions of any industrial society, namely the economic, commercial, and financial institutions, in particular, in the coming period, the great multinational corporations, which are not very far from us physically tonight. Those are the basic institutions of oppression and coercion and autocratic rule that appear to be neutral. After all, they say, well, we're subject to the democracy of the marketplace.
The last theories to be examined in this lecture is the Italian Giorgio Agamben. He was educated at University of Rome and is professor at Università di Venezia. And he has written widely on philosophy, politics, theology, as well as radical critical theory. Agamben has collaborated with eminent intellectuals like Pier Paolo Pasolini, Italo Calvino, Guy Debord, Jean-Luc Nancy, Jacques Derrida, Antonio Negri, Jean-François Lyotard, and many others, some of which are explored in this series of lectures on critical theory. Agamben's strongest influence are Martin Heidegger, Walter Benjamin, and Michel Foucault. His concept of biopolitics carried forth the work of Foucault and informs many of his writings. He has also been intimately connected with Antonio Negri to Italy post-1968 left politics. In 1981, Agamben discovered several important lost manuscripts by Walter Benjamin in the archives of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. And Benjamin had left these manuscripts to Georges Bataille when he abandoned Paris to escape from the Nazis. And these manuscripts constitute what Benjamin published later as the thesis on the concept of history. In the 1980s, the expansion of the European community generated a theoretical debate following the publication of Jean-Luc Nancy, La Communauté des Ouvriers, which was translated into English as the Inoperative Community, and also by Maurice Blanchot's response to this publication, La Communauté Inavouable, the unavoidable community in English. Agamben proposed his own model of community, which would not presuppose categories of identity, in a volume entitled The Coming Community, which was published in 1990. But his best-known book is Homo Sacer, Sovereign Power and Better Life, from 1995, where he uses Roman law as a departure point to trace the history of the state of exception, from Aristotle through to contemporary times. He argues that the sovereign has constantly placed the idea of a state that remains outside or above both holy and mundane law as a foundation of all its actions. And you have a quotation there from his volume. If it is the sovereign who, insofar as he decides on the state of exception, has the power to decide which life may be killed without commission or of homicide, in the age of biopolitics, this power becomes emancipated from the state of exception and transformed into the power to decide the point at which life ceases to be politically relevant. When life becomes the supreme political value, not only is the problem of life's non-value thereby posed, it is as if the ultimate ground of sovereign power were at stake in this decision. In modern biopolitics, sovereign is he who decides on the value or non-value of life as such. In A State of Exception, a volume from 2005, Agamben traces the concept of a state of exception used by German jurist Carl Schmitt. He investigates the increase of power by governments which they employ in supposedly times of crisis. Within a state of emergency, Agamben refers to the states of exception, where constitutional rights can be diminished, superseded, or rejected in the process of claiming this extension of power by a government. More specifically, the context of the book addresses the problematic of the military orders issued by President George Bush on November 13, 2001, regarding the Taliban's capture in Afghanistan and the breach of the agreements of the Geneva Convention. And you have a couple of quotations there from the volume A State of Exception. One of the essential elements of the state of exception, the provisional abolition of the distinction among legislative, executive, and judicial powers here, shows its tendency to become a lasting practice of government. And the second one, as it is well known, what characterizes both the fascist and the Nazi regimes is that they allowed the existing constitutions, the Albertine Statute and the Weimar Constitution respectively, to subsist, and according to a paradigm that has been acutely defined as dual state, they placed beside the legal constitution a second structure, often not legally formalized, that could exist alongside the other because of the state of exception. On your screen, you have several books, you have series, TV series, adaptations to cinema that have been inspired by this idea of the state of exception in Agamben. So finally, I just finished with Agamben's volume, What is an Apparatus, from 2009. Here he includes 3 essays that investigate Foucault's notion of the apparatus, expanding the use of the term to include all networks that bind us and result not in the production of a dissubjected subject. You have a quotation from the volume. Further expanding the already large class of Foucaultian apparatuses, I shall call an apparatus literally anything that has in some way the capacity to capture, determine, intercept, model, control, or secure the gestures, behaviors, opinions, or discourses of living beings. Not only therefore prisons, madhouses, the Panopticon, schools, confessions, factories, disciplines, juridical measures, and so forth, whose connection with power is, in a certain sense, evident, but also the pen, writing, literature, philosophy, agriculture, cigarettes, navigation, computer, cellular telephones, and why not, language itself, which is perhaps the most ancient of apparatuses, one in which thousands and thousands of years ago, a primitive inadvertently let himself be captured, and probably without realizing the consequences that he was about to face. So again, on your screen, you have suggestions of books and movies that have treated the topic of the Panopticon and the madhouse and other forms of apparatuses, as Agamben notes. So the video finishes with a sequence from Agamben talking about Foucault, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Entre 1975 et 1984, au moment où la pensée politique connaît une phase de stagnation, les travaux de Michel Foucault sont venus déblayer les terrains des faux concepts qu'il a encombrés. Dans un cours du 5 janvier 1983, Foucault résume sa stratégie en 2 points. Premier point, substituer à l'histoire des dominations l'analyse des procédures et des techniques de gouvernementalité. Deuxième point, substituer à la théorie du sujet et à l'histoire de la subjectivité l'analyse historique des processus de subjectivation et des pratiques de soi. Donc, il est clair, abandon des universaux vides qui monopolisaient l'attention des théoriciens de la politique, la loi, la souveraineté, la volonté générale, etc., au profit d'une analyse détaillée des pratiques et des dispositifs gouvernementaux. Donc, on le sait, plus de pouvoir comme une hypostase séparée, mais des relations de pouvoir, plus des sujets en position fondatrice ou transcendantale, mais une analyse ponctuelle des pratiques et des processus de subjectivation. Je crois que si l'on veut saisir ce que a signifié, 15 ans après Foucault, l'apparition des tikkun dans la pensée politique, c'est de ces contextes qu'il faut partir. S'il y avait chez Foucault, on l'a vu, un abandon sans réserve de toute perspective anthropologique, cependant, au croisement entre les techniques des gouvernements et les processus de subjectivation, la place restait peut-être vide. Ou plutôt, il n'y avait dans cette zone, dans la zone où des rencontres entre les techniques du pouvoir et les processus de subjectivation, il y avait peut-être ces figures qu'un texte extraordinaire de 1983, La vie des hommes infâmes, justement appelle des vies infâmes, des ombres sans visage, extraits des archives de police et des lettres de cachet, sur lesquelles la rencontre avec le pouvoir projette soudainement sa lumière obscure. Je crois que la nouveauté des tikkun est qu'il opère, par contre, à la fois une radicalisation et un nouage de 2 stratégies, l'analyse des techniques de gouvernement et les processus de subjectivation, qui, chez Foucault, restaient peut-être, n'avaient pas trouvé peut-être leur point de jonction. Ainsi, si, comme Foucault l'avait montré dans sa microphysique du pouvoir, le pouvoir circule et a toujours circulé dans des dispositifs de tout genre, juridiques, linguistiques, matériels, etc., pour tikkun, le pouvoir n'est plus que cela. Il ne se dresse plus en face de la société civile et à la vie comme une hypostase souveraine, il coïncide entièrement avec la société et la vie. Le pouvoir n'a plus de centre, il n'est qu'une immense accumulation de dispositifs dans lesquels viennent se prendre les sujets, ou plutôt, comme aurait dit Foucault, les processus de subjectivation. Face à cela, le geste de tikkun est de nouer, faire coïncider, même sans réserve, les 2 plans et les 2 analyses que chez Foucault restaient séparés, technique de gouvernement, dispositif de gouvernement, sujet. Il y a un texte dans un des essais qui est publié dans les livres, qui s'appelle Métaphysique critique. Un texte le dit très clairement. Une théorie du sujet n'est possible que comme théorie des dispositifs. Ainsi, toute la recherche dérisoire des nouveaux sujets politiques qui paralysent encore, qui a paralysé encore la tradition de la gauche, la recherche de la gauche, est du coup liquidée. Théorie du sujet et théorie des dispositifs coïncident. Voilà, c'est dans cette zone opaque d'indifférence entre théorie du sujet et théorie des dispositifs qui se situent les textes qui sont là recueillis. Déjà la théorie du Bloom dans Tikkun 1 et dans Tikkun 2, les deux textes majeurs qui sont republiés dans les livres, c'est-à-dire l'introduction à la guerre civile et une métaphysique critique pourrait naître comme science des dispositifs. Il est évident, il me semble, que si on se situe dans cette zone d'indifférence, tous les concepts de la politique classique, État, société civile, classe, citoyen, représentation, etc., perdent leur sens. Mais d'autre part, c'est seulement à se placer dans cette perspective, dans cette zone d'indifférence, que les concepts élaborés par Tikkun, les Bloom, la politique statique, les partis imaginaires, guerre civile, dans le sens particulier que c'est moi dans les textes, tous ces concepts acquièrent leur sens propre uniquement dans cette perspective. Et c'est à partir de cette situation dans une zone d'indifférence que je crois qu'il faut comprendre les pratiques d'écriture, de pensée et d'action qui se jouent dans Tikkun. Oui, quant à l'écriture, oui, Eric l'a déjà évoqué, par exemple, il ne s'agit pas simplement d'une écriture anonyme, bien sûr encore moins pseudonyme ou hétéronyme. Là, on voit bien que les efforts de la police pour attribuer à tout prix un texte à un auteur ou un auteur à un texte ne peuvent pas aboutir. Il n'y a pas d'auteur possible pour ce texte, car il se place dans une zone où le concept d'auteur n'a plus de sens. Le concept d'auteur, Foucault l'avait déjà montré, a marché toujours, a fonctionné dans notre culture toujours d'une façon double. C'est d'une part une figure du sujet, d'autre part c'est un dispositif d'attribution, vous le savez, d'une responsabilité pénale.